So we're going to start section 2 now. The war expands. Of course, you're going to be taking notes using the outline style that we practiced in class. So in this section of our study of the American Revolution, we're going to look and see how the war expands and really becomes a world war as other European powers become involved and contribute to American independence. So let's take a look and see exactly how we got to this point. Of course, you know the battles of Saratoga was a key factor in getting Europeans abroad, help from abroad. But really, it goes all the way back to the beginning of the American Revolution in 1776. France begins to give secret aid to the Americans. Remember, France and England have been fighting each other forever, and there's this old saying that an enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so the French see the American Revolution as a way to stick it to their old friends, the English. So they begin giving us aid as early as 1776, and they form an official alliance in 1778 after the battles of Saratoga. And with that official alliance, they agree to send Americans money to pay soldiers, to buy supplies. They send American supplies, and they even send actual French troops to America to supplement the Continental Army and fight alongside the Americans. And they also persuade Spain to ally itself with the Americans. So now not only is England fighting America, but they also have to keep an eye out for France and Spain. So this really becomes almost a world war. And a lot of this was due to the work of Benjamin Franklin. At the beginning of the war, Benjamin Franklin was sent to Paris, France, to meet with the King of France and persuade the King to give help to the United States, to sign a treaty with the United States against England in this war against England. Now you have to understand that this was very risky for the King of France. The French had colonies all over the world, just like England did. And if one of the English colonies can declare independence, what's to stop some French colonies from doing the same thing? So it took quite some time for Ben Franklin to persuade the king, but eventually, after some success on the battlefield, he was able to persuade King Louis XVI to support the American independence movement. You can see this picture of Benjamin Franklin dressed in his beaver hat that became quite fashionable on the streets of Paris. He was well known and became known as quite a ladies' man while he was in Paris. He really enjoyed himself for the years that he was living there, trying to get help for the new country of the United States. Anyway, the French and Spanish alliances forces Britain to spread the military over many fronts, and because of this, Britain can't concentrate its troops just on Americans. It also has to fight the British the French and Spanish as well. So it really forces the British Army to spread out and thin its ranks, so to speak. Of course, use that pause button if you need to pause and write down these notes. I'm going to move forward now. Specifically, we're going to take a look at some specific help that Europeans provided George Washington and the Continental Army, and we need to talk about a guy by the name of Marquis de Lafayette, who served in Washington's army and really became Washington's kind of right-hand man, the son that Washington never had. Marquis de Lafayette, I'm going to show you a picture of him in a minute. He was a young French nobleman who was looking to get some experience on the battlefield, which is what young noblemen needed to do in those days to prove themselves and move up the noble ranks. So he decided to set sail for America and join Washington's army at the young age of right around 19. He was very young. He was very rich. He paid for this trip to America by himself and gave money to Washington's army. He was put in charge of an entire army division, and he won the American soldiers' respect and fought in many battles besides George Washington, this Marquis de Lafayette. He actually was in charge of an American army. And then, of course, we have General, a German, Baron von Steuben was his name. Baron von Steuben. And he was put in charge of training the Continental Army. He actually presented himself to George Washington as a great Prussian army general who fought in European wars under Frederick the Great, who was a Prussian king who conquered much of Eastern Europe. As it turns out, Baron von Steuben completely lied about his resume. He was not a great officer in the Prussian army. He was really a nobody and came to America and kind of lied about his resume. And Washington found out about it. But at that point, he was already doing such a good job of training the troops and disciplining the army that Washington decided to keep him in place. He couldn't speak English. All of his orders had to be translated from German into English, but he did a really good job training the Continental Army, particularly to charge with bayonets and fight against the British. And we're going to talk more about how they fought in the 18th century, the strategy and style and techniques. Basically, a bayonet is a long knife attached to the end of guns, and these armies would take turns charging each other with these bayonets and trying to run the other army off the field. Baron von Steuben trained the Continental Army to charge with bayonets against the British Army and not run off the field at the first sight of a British red coat. So those are two people that you need to be familiar with, Marquis de Lafayette and Baron von Steuben. And here you see a picture of Marquis de Lafayette on the left side of the screen, leading an American army forward. You see a little drummer boy there. And over on the right you see the winter at Valley Forge. You see actually George Washington here, and you can see the men are in rough shape. They're covered in blankets. It's cold outside. The winter at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, was a crisis for the American Army, the Continental Army. Washington's army had retreated from Philadelphia in the winter, and what you have to keep in mind is in those days the armies took the winters off. They didn't fight. They used the winter time to supply, to train, to prepare for the spring, for the fighting season. And in Washington's army at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, the army was constantly short on supplies, food, clothing. About 1/4 of the soldiers die in Valley Forge. The conditions were miserable. Meanwhile, the British Army was held up inside Philadelphia, inside nice warm houses and barracks, and Washington, the Continental Army, was freezing to death in the woods at Valley Forge. Some soldiers actually deserted or left military duty. The punishment for that is usually death if you're caught, but most soldiers stayed. And Washington uses this winter to teach and train his troops and teach them discipline. Baron von Steuben takes time to train the Continental Army so that it could stand toe-to-toe against the British Army and not run and retreat at the first moment of fighting. The Continental Army was very undisciplined. Men would go to the bathroom wherever they wanted to in camp, and this caused many men to die from waterborne diseases. So there was strict discipline where if men were caught urinating in anything other than a bathroom, they would get 25 whips from a lash. So Washington used this winter at Valley Forge to train and teach discipline to his troops, and they actually emerged stronger than when they entered.